thanks to everyone for joining us. And I promise you, if you can't already answer the question, when can I retire? You will have the tools in the not so distant future. So stay with us. My guest today is actually my wife of almost 18 years, Erin Kosick. The goal for today's podcast is for us to collaborate as only a couple could in working through some of the ideas and what I'll call exercises above. Welcome, hon.
Great to be here. I think I've got my questions all ready. As truly a layperson, I think I can help our audience right off the bat. You stated emotionally retired earlier. I doubt much of your audience knows that term because you weren't my husband. I wouldn't know it either.
Emotionally retired. Emotionally retired is something that I define as you've heard me talk about it before, you get to a point in your life financially where you've been diligent, frugal, saved money, and you wake up one day, and if you go to work, it's because you choose to, not because you have to. Because literally, if you never earned another dime the rest of your life, between your different income sources, and the most important income source is the money that you'd be drawing off of the money that you've accumulated, is you have enough money to support you for the rest of your life and any other goals that you have thereafter.
Okay, my first question based upon your intro is not to hierarchy these topics that need attended to, but instead, can we work through these chronologically? What is the first exercise a family should work through toward their goal here?
Okay. Great question. I don't know if it's something that's completely chronological, but to make this complex process feel less overwhelming, the goal is to solve for something. Anybody who knows me is that I'm always doing things in a math format and always want to solve for something. And this exercise is absolutely no different. I start by asking clients, when would you like to be emotionally retired? And then I always get the couples looking at each other and thinking through it. And it's all part of a process. The reason I say this come across as less overwhelming is once you have that date, you now just need to solve how much will be needed to get there.
Okay, so how do we solve for how much will be needed?
Okay, I call how much will be needed your nut. You've heard me use that term before. Nut is to say that I need to have X amount of dollars at Y age or after. Okay, so if you think through it, whether I'm 65, I want to have $2 million, or 67, I need to have $1.7 million. That's the variables that I'm speaking to. What your nut is will be dictated by the answer to all the important questions. How much will we need to spend per year in retirement? I have found this process to be much easier than one would expect. In the 30 plus years and the hundreds, if not thousands of clients I have helped with retirement planning, I honestly can think of only one client where this didn't really work out the way you would have wanted it to, and there ended up being some stress to the portfolio later on. And honestly, that was because the individual I was working with at the time lied as to how much they were going to spend, and ended up spending significantly more. I think I really overcome that and how I help people work through their budgets. But that's really what that's going to be about. All right. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the nut. And everybody out there, you're going to see some technology that I started building more than 30 years ago. I know it's just in Excel, but I think it's going to do a darn good job of allowing me to bring this exercise to life. So speaking about a nut, this is an individual family. Let's say that they're 30 years old and they've never saved a dime before. And I would try to make this simplistic and give two different examples. This family, for example, wants to spend $75,000 a year. Okay. They don't see significant raises in the future. We want to do this in somewhat of a straight line exercise. So what you're seeing is I ran and came to the conclusion of a nut of $873,000. Okay. And that was based upon needing to spend $75,000. If you look out here, it says 178,900. That's not 75. Well, you know what? You got inflation of 2.5%, 35 years to retirement. $2.37, multiply that by 75, you got $178,000. That's how I got to that figure. Okay. So how'd I come up with the nut? What I did, which looks like huge numbers, is I had to make an assumption for hypothetically a family in today's dollars, somebody making $75,000. And let's say that their spouse stays home. So ultimately, when they take Social Security, they're taking what is known as spousal. So the non-working spouse, or the spouse that's worked maybe less than half the time or half the dollars of the primary breadwinner, is going to get half of what the primary breadwinner gets. That $93,000 may look huge, but just like the exercise that I just did, that $93,300 is equivalent to less than $40,000 in today's dollars, which is probably pretty similar to what this individual would receive, simply based upon inflation. All right. So if they have nothing to save, and they started saving $6,000 a year, and only increased that by the rate of inflation all these years, not taking into account the multitude of variables. Everybody who's listening out there today knows the world is very dynamic and ever-changing, and that's one of the greatest impacts of doing periodic checks. Doing what I've done for 33 years, I know when clients come in multiple times per year, they want really from the time that they are 45 on, as you know, in our age group, we want to spend at least one meeting a year going through this exercise. So we're keeping it simplistic as we can today. In this scenario, the reason I came up with $873,000 is I hypothetically said that they came back and said, we're not overly concerned with leaving a legacy or an inheritance. So if we're running out of money in our late 90s, we're fine with that. I also noted before, appropriate but very conservative in terms of a rate of return. And so I'm showing 5.5% while working and 5%. Fortunately, I could tell you that, as you know, that a lot of our, all of our clients have received that have been with us for a while, a lot better returns than that. But I like to run scenarios where I say that there's at least an 80 to 90% chance, which what we are looking at here today, is your actual experience will be better. All right. And then I have retirement, like I said, getting conservative and earning a 5% rate of return. So if they started with zero, they earned the rate of return that I noted. And you notice that this is negative. The reason that is negative is because that column I call the distribution column. So distributions are positive and contributions are negative. All right. So here we are, 5.5% return, setting aside $329,000 over 35 years, then turns into $873,000. All right. This family's now 65, chooses to retire, takes Social Security a little bit early. And as I said before, to generate in today's dollars $75,000, they would need $179 approximately. So they would need about $40,000 from their investments. We look down, and what do we see? We're showing annual growth of more than 41 in year one of retirement and a distribution of 40. What does that mean? Is their actual balance went up in that given year. So if they earned a straight line 5% rate of return, they had more money their second year retirement, even after taking the distribution. But as we noted, the boogeyman of inflation is going to get you. And eventually, your nuts, or the balance that you have on January 1 every year, is going to go down. And in this example, they went out of money at age 96. All right, same exact example for someone who wants to live on $150,000. Right, before I jump over there, did want to note, and we'll talk in a much greater detail, I'm sure at some point later today, about savings rate. This family needed to save 70% of what they were making. 8% of what they were making. 150, I have 13 in there. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so we're taking this family and, all right, they want to live on 150,000 in today's dollars. That's why we have 354. I don't need to do the math. That's just double the number we came up with before. Okay, Same rate of return while working, same rate of return while retired. All right, saving 19,000, that's negative. Their nut is 2.8 million. If that makes you fall out of your seat, it should. What you're going to need in the form of a nut and something else we'll talk about later falls into what percentage of my retirement income is going to come from Social Security. So if you want to live a middle class, upper middle class, or beyond, you're not going to get a lot of your income from Social Security. So that nut's going to be bigger and bigger. All right, so with the 150, this person's nut is 2.8 million. How did they get to 2.8 million from nothing at 30 years old? You know how they did it? Saving 19.5, increasing it by no more than inflation every year. Their Social Security would be a little bit higher, but not when you look at the nut one, if 200+% higher, their 401k barely went 50% higher. So that fits that in. So what do we got here? Let's have the fun part. What happens to that 2.8 million? They will then need $130,000 to supplement Social Security for their needed income in retirement of $354,000. Fun stuff, huh?
Oh, yeah.
All right. I'm glad you're enjoying yourself, hon. That's all that matters. So, once again, year one, they earn more than they distribute. That is not the case many years later. By age 80, they are earning 113, but having to distribute 188. So that nut goes down every year. In this example, they also run out of money in their mid to late 90s. So if they live to their mid to late 90s, there's not going to be that much of a legacy. But what we did is we were able to solve for the nut. And then we start talking about other things like savings rates and distribution rates. And they may be new to you, but we're going to cover them today.
Well, that was a lot. That fits perfect, I think, with my next question.
Okay.
Now, we know how much we need, but I'm sure most people in their 40s or 50s don't know, they don't have that nut already. How do we figure out their savings target? And being we're about to speak to savings target, I've heard planners teach about saving 20% of your gross income. That sounds like a lot. Should that be everyone's goal?
All right, that's a magnificent question. So I was intimating it at the end. In these examples, I had these people starting at 30 years old. Not everybody has the ability or does start saving by the age of 30. And sometimes life happens. So you'll have some years where you're saving more and some years you're saving less. It's not unheard of for somebody to get a bonus or to have my experience is a lot of couples, kids are out of the house by the time they're 55. And honestly, most people make more money between 55 on than they've ever made before by a long shot. Okay. So, but in this straight line, this individual, as I noted, needed to save 8% to complete their plan. The second individual who had that nut of 2.8 million, they were needing to save 13%. Now, let me change one variable and see what that does. Remember, these people were making and wanting to spend $150 in 2025 numbers. Okay, the year 2025. Let's say, for example, their goal is to build a significant legacy. And they want to build it through savings. All right? So let's hypothetically say they do save 20%. At 90 years old, they have 6.4 million. Trial and error. Let's say they say, I'm not looking to leave anybody $6.4 million. Maybe in today's dollars that I want to leave something that would be equivalent to, 1.5 million. Honestly, we may be in there already. So that's 60 years. 60 of power times 1 million. That's 4.4 million. There's not a significant difference there. So you could change a variable having a starting just a couple of years later and be forced to get to that need. But the most obvious example is going to be, is this same couple didn't start at 30. They literally started at 35. And this couple starts at 35. Pretty similar to the other exercises. They're pretty much close to destitute late in their 90s. And they had to save 20% rather than 13%. We've all heard the stats, and they're true. If you take someone who starts saving at 25 and you compare them to someone who starts saving at 40, the person who starts saving at 25 will barely have to save half of what that person who waits all the way till they're 40. As Einstein once said, the eighth wonder of the world is compounding interest.
So what if someone starts saving late, or for some reason the numbers just don't work?
Well, being we started this in reverse, working from how much is needed to retire, this will lead this next step to be trial and error. Okay. Hopefully you determine how much your client can save, plug in reasonable rate of return, and results come back, and they will have the nut, if not more. But to your question, many times, if not most times, it's not the case. And when it's not the case, discussion has to take place. Often over a glass of wine, and in this particular instance, maybe over a shot or two, before the next step in the trial and error. And both spouses need to agree. Okay? There are 3 ways to make a plan work that originally does not work. As a couple, you're either going to need to work longer, spend less in retirement, or save more now, or some combination of the 3. One really cool number is, as it pertains to working longer, for every 1 year that you work longer, it will provide close to up to 3 years of retirement income. And my experience now that I'm getting older is a lot of people get very good at their jobs when they get older. And sometimes working that extra 1 year isn't as stressful. I tell you, though, there are many where it's extremely stressful. You have somebody who's out there, working a laborist type job or working for the man. It's a lot different than being able to define your own work.
So I've heard people in the industry talk about a 4 or 5% distribution rate. What is a distribution rate? Can you explain that to our audience?
Yeah. I have my opinions on distribution rates, but as it pertains to those listening today, there's a pro and a con. The con is distribution rates often get caught up in what is known as a Monte Carlo analysis. I've had other podcasts where I mentioned Monte Carlo analysis, and I'm not necessarily the hugest fan. Many of you listening today know what it is. Probably much more than half have no clue what it is. It's a regression analysis, which says, what is the chance that I will run out of money in retirement? Okay? In the most simplistic sense, what it is you're taking your nut and saying, what % of my nut do I need in the form of a distribution? So in a hypothetical, simplistic example, if I had someone with $2 million as their nuts, and they want very conservative, want to, in essence, never run out of money, it may come back and say, hey, what if I can get 4%? 4% of $2 million is $80,000. And from a Monte Carlo analysis, it would come back and say, if you take all historic data for what stocks have done and bonds have done, there's not been an example over an extended period of time that one person would run out of money, and then you have 5%, and a 5% $2 million would be $100,000. Well, the Monte Carlo thing sort of gets thrown a loop is where I look at is 2 components. If I were starting from, say, end of 2020, I have an expensive stock market and I have interest rates that are at, 10-year treasury bonds that are barely yielding 1%. That 4% would be pushing the envelope. Fortunately, today, when you have fixed rates and you could get 5% in a guaranteed return, and if you don't know how, ask us, we'll tell you. Then maybe you can go to a 5% distribution rate and still be extremely conservative. If you have a stock market that's valuations are very low, then maybe you could take some of the worst examples that I can think of in my history was in the late 90s, having individuals speaking with them, wanting to retire on $500,000 because they've been used to making 15, 20% on their money per year. And they were looking to take 10% distribution rates or more. And we all know, unfortunately, in that particular instance, the stock market lost 20, 30, 40% in the next few years. And if that person was taking 10%, that money's gone pretty quickly. Let me show you a simplistic example of what I'm speaking to. Let's take somebody today with $2 million. They need $190,000 a year to live. So they're going to require a 6% distribution rate. Okay? Let's hypothetically say that they're going to try to target 7% per year because they think that's a reasonable target with the level of risk that they're going to take. All right. Well, what if they lost 15% in the first year? If we think back to 2022, stocks lost 20%, bonds lost 13%, losing 15% certainly would not be out of the question. And let's say after that, they had a magnificent bounce where they made 9% per year thereafter. So their average return over the next 25 years was 8%, yet they were out of money at 93. Let's say in reverse, they got that 7% per year. Okay. They get that 7% per year and they don't have that negative 15 up front. That money once again lasts to their mid to late 90s. That's the very big risks of some people wanting to take distribution rates in excess of 5%. If I'm going to take in excess of 5%, and I'm going to have to take risk. And if I do take risk, it just happens that on the front end, returns are very poor. But that's what distribution rate is pretty cool. So, if I was a person in retirement today, I would sit back and say, how much money do I have saved? All right. In investable assets. I have all my other income streams, Social Security, pensions, or otherwise. How much am I extracting from mine? What percent is that? And if you're 67 or older, and it's 4 or 5% or less, the numbers would share that the chances of you running out of money is not so great. If your distribution rate was 6, 7% or more, you may have an issue on your hand. All right, hon. Big question. The reason I brought you in here is, can I retire? No. All right. Okay, I expected that to be the answer. So, all you out there, if you found this information helpful or you want to know more about, speak to your advisor. If for any reason you have questions of us, our contact information will follow. Have a great one. For all podcast or guest-related questions, please email us at dlacadvisors@dlacadvisors.com. For all questions or inquiries into the services that are provided by DLAC Wealth Advisors, please contact us at elliot.singer@dlacadvisors.com. That's Elliot with 2 T's. Please also visit our description for helpful links.